Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this live town hall discussion on the impacts of the coronavirus outbreak on the economy. This town hall is being hosted by Congressman Denny Heck, who represents Washington's 10th Congressional District. We've been very fortunate to be joined at 5 p.m. by Jared Bernstein, former chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Biden. Congressman Heck and Jared Bernstein will be discussing the path forward for the economy. We've been collecting questions from you through social media and through constituent mail, and we'll use those questions to drive this discussion. If you're watching live on Facebook and have a question, please ask it in the comment section for this video, and we'll get to some of the questions coming in from live viewers as well. Before we get to questions, I'm going to hand it over to Congressman Heck and then to Jared Bernstein for some opening remarks. Congressman Heck, welcome.
Thank you, Rita. Thank all of you for joining me. This is now, I believe, our 6th episode in a series of town halls we're holding on issues related to the COVID crisis and pandemic. I am especially pleased today to welcome Jared Bernstein, who, in addition to having been chief economist to Vice President Biden, also is the executive director of the Task Force on the Middle Class. He's fairly well credentialed here. He has his PhD in all this business from Columbia University. He's a good friend and somebody who brings an enormous amount to the table. I've been privileged beyond measure to be able to collaborate with him some over the last few years, and I'm thrilled to have him here. Here's what we're trying to do tonight, a little different than before. I'm trying to get out a little bit ahead of where we're at. All 5 of our previous teletown halls or town halls have been on issues related to mitigation of the pandemic, mitigation of the free fall of the economy, trying to shove as much assistance to individuals and small businesses as we can. Now, you all know we passed 4 bills and we're in the late stages of doing a 5th bill. This 5th bill too will be a mitigation bill, but someday, and in the not too distant future, we're going to turn the corner and start talking about recovery. After we have halted the free fall, how can we begin to grow this economy again going forward? And that's the conversation I'm hoping to have tonight with Jared, because there simply is nobody better to engage in that conversation with. So I will stop there and let Jared make any opening remarks he has, and then we'll get to your questions. And thank you again very much, all of you, for joining us.
Well, I couldn't be more pleased to join you. I knew Congressman Heck was a smart guy, and now I understand because he's read all those books behind him. So that explains a lot. Congressman Heck and I were like soul brothers or blood brothers. The minute we met, in about 60 seconds, we were having the same enjoyable, intense conversations that we're having now. So sometimes you just click with somebody, and that's how that happened. I really liked the way you kick things off. We could go through all kinds of unsettling numbers about what's been going on in the US economy and the global economy, and perhaps we will and perhaps we should. Basically, the way I view it is the American economy is 70% consumer spending. That's our GDP. 70% of it is consumer spending. So when you tell the American consumer to stay home and sit on their hands, guess what? You're going to shut the economy down. And that's what we did. And I think we did it for reasons that I'm sure everyone here understands. And I've long been a sort of Keynesian styled economist. So the kinds of mitigation measures are very, very familiar to me. But let me just end my initial comments here by talking about this recovery idea. Here's the way I view it. We seem to have 100-year floods every year, right? We bail out major industries. 10 years ago it was the banks, now it's a whole set of other corporations. We bail out major industries every decade. Every time we hit a crisis, we have to basically reinvent our unemployment insurance system. Our healthcare system is simply not up to the task that we assign it, and it's uniquely dysfunctional in the sense that we spend a lot more compared to many other advanced economies with no better and in some ways worse outcomes. So it seems like it would be the biggest waste of a crisis not to come out the other side of this with an amply funded, functional, competent federal sector that was able to insulate its members and its citizens from these kinds of shocks that occur with such frequency, not to the extent that we're going to replace private markets or businesses or anything like that, but to create a backdrop of economic security wherein people can flourish. And that, I think, needs to be the goal of what happens next.
Thank you, Jared. Rena, do you have a series of questions?
Yes, let's get started. So for starters, we're going to start with Linda from Facebook. Everyone knows what to do. Open up business, let citizens work, pay their bills, shop, improve their commercial practices, and we will be fine. Congress needs to work hard on real issues, not fight the executive branch.
Well, thank you, Linda. I think it would be helpful to take a quick step back and remind ourselves why it is that we induced a coma of our own economy and on a purposeful and voluntary basis. And it was because of the fear of the spread of the pandemic and the COVID virus in our country. Let's take stock of where we are today. As of now, I think about 75,000 people have perished as a consequence of the virus, far in excess of the common flu system. This is not the flu. First of all, it's way more transmissible. It's easier to get than the flu is. And secondly, it's just frankly way, way more deadly. As people are often inclined to indicate, 75,000 is considerably more than the 58,000 who died in Vietnam over a 10-year period of time. We're talking about a 3-month period of time. And so one of the reasons why we put the economy on pause was because of a fear, and a very realistic fear, that the healthcare system and the healthcare delivery system would be completely overwhelmed. And I'd like Jared to talk about this in a second or two. What would be the consequence of an implosion of the healthcare system to the economy as a whole, to society, to the healthcare system itself? And that's why we went to the social distancing thing. I think people in Washington state should feel good about the number of lives that have been saved. Now, I don't say this with any lack of recognition about the harm and the damage and the pain that is out there. That is absolutely abundantly clear, which is why Congress is acting as aggressively as it is to try to mitigate some of that. There is, but compare Washington state, for example, to New Jersey. It's about 12 to 15% more populated. Granted, there are a lot of variables here, but Washington state has suffered 850 deaths as a consequence of Governor Inslee enforcing and adopting aggressive social distancing measures. 850. New Jersey is 10 times that, more than 8,500. That's a lot of lives saved as a consequence. And yes, Linda, you're absolutely right. There has been damage done to people's lives that we cannot ignore, and we must seek and strive to help. So, first question, Jared, I want to kick it over to you. What would be the consequence if we had not acted and the healthcare system had fallen apart? What would be the consequence long-term to the economy if that were to be the case?
So the healthcare sector is a huge portion of our economy, 18%, and it's also a massive employer. In fact, during the last recession, which we used to call the Great Recession, its magnitude is going to be swamped by this one. Every single month, the healthcare sector added jobs. So we're losing jobs everywhere else. The healthcare sector added jobs. If you look at some of the pressures on federal and state budgets, they largely come from healthcare and retirement as well, because of the pressures that the aging population puts on the healthcare system. So it's a system that is already facing tremendous pressure. And as I said in my opening comments, there are things that we do in our healthcare sector that I think are uniquely problematic in terms of access, in terms of price, in terms of the amount of sort of profitability that sloshes around out there for many of the providers that kind of feed the healthcare sector. And so it's already a pretty stressed sector. If we hadn't taken the measures that we have to so-called flatten the curve, I know it's a cliche, but really what it means to me is that we gave our healthcare sector enough time to try to catch up to the magnitude of the health crisis that they were going to face. And I think that we have done that in a way that has not only preserved the sector for the time being, but that it'll come out the other side stronger. And I think that'll be a plus for our economy. The other thing we've done is we've revealed a really important problem, structural problem in our economy. The vast majority of working age people get their health coverage through work, okay? That's a very unique American thing. I mean, people may not know that, but in every other country, that's not how they do it. In our country, we tie health insurance to work for working age people, and not just for us, but our families. Well, what happens when 30 million people get laid off? They lose their coverage. And so that connection of employment and health coverage is a kind of a fatally flawed connection at a time like this. And it's one we need to repair in future policy.
Jared, I have a follow-up. I don't know if you've made a study of the Spanish influenza of 1918, but what we know about that is that a second wave came through because people took their foot off the brake sooner than they should have. And there was even more massive and wholesale death that occurred in the country throughout the world, as a matter of fact. So can you say anything about what the economic consequence of having a second wave come back that takes way more lives and burdens the healthcare system?
So
people are concerned, as is Linda, that we get people back to work. I am too.
Well, actually, let me start with that concern, because I actually share Linda's concern big time. I mean, I have to imagine, Linda, that there are many more of you out there than you might recognize. Most people in this country have very little to fall back on. They don't have much savings. If they get hit with an expense, they're really stuck. And by the way, repeating expenses, revolving charges like rent come up all the time. So, you know, we do not have an economy wherein people can't get back to work for very long. So I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. But on the other side of the equation is what the congressman was just talking about. If we have another flare-up and another shutdown, that's not only just going to set the economy back to where it is now, but I'm afraid it's going to set it back further. Because what it will do is it will spook consumers and investors to the point that the next time that we say, okay, green light, everybody go back in the water, sorry, mixing metaphors, that people won't believe them. People won't believe the authorities, and it'll take that much longer for the recovery to get back on track. So I totally hear where you're coming from. I'm afraid we need to take the measures we're taking to get to where you and I both want to get to.
Next question, Rena.
Cool. Yes. So Shell from Facebook asks, how can we make sure there's actual oversight into where the money is going? And bills are well written so that certain entities can't exploit loopholes, which end up leaving people with nothing. For example, the loophole of the CARES Act that allowed corporations to steal money allocated for small business.
Great question, Shell, and one of ongoing concern of ours. First of all, I think it's important to note that the swiftness and the magnitude of the action by Congress, because of the magnitude of the problem, inevitably was going to result in some sloppiness. I'd like to believe we could pass a perfect legislation instantly, big, bold, efficient, effective. But the fact of the matter is, when we act that way, there will inevitably be some slop. And you are absolutely right. There was, and you identified some of that. What we hope we do is get better every time. Remember, we passed 4 bills. We're going to pass the 5th. We hope we're getting better at it in each and every instance. Now, in order to monitor all of this, we have set up an oversight committee, as a matter of fact, and it's extremely important that we do this. Everybody is often fond of quoting the fact that President Truman set one up, or then Vice President or Senator Truman, I don't remember which, during World War II, right? He must have been a senator right at the beginning of World War II, to oversee defense expenditures, because people were worried, again, about fraud and abuse and waste and the like. And the historical analysis is that it saved the country billions and billions of dollars. We've done that. Frankly, part of our problem here is getting some cooperation with the administration. You may have seen, for example, that one of the committees was to have Dr. Fauci in to ask some questions. He just refused. To some degree, this is a reflection and a manifestation of the polarization between the House and the administration. But it does not, in any way, shape, or form, Shell, change the underlying constitutional principle that the United States Congress has a duty to provide oversight for these expenditures, and we will endeavor to do so. Jared, you may have some more historic refs here are perspective.
Yeah, a little bit, just a little, because I just, we're pretty shoulder to shoulder on that answer, so I don't want to take much time. So I heard that the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said the following, and I think he's correct. The Small Business Administration, which by the way is the smallest administration in DC, their budget is in the millions, not the billions. So they're a tiny little agency by Washington standards. They gave away more money in 14 days than they had given away in 14 years. That was the magnitude of the fire hose that they set up. Now, I shouldn't really say giving away because some of those resources are grants and some of them are loans, and we'll see, precisely how that works out. But there was a trade-off between speed and accuracy. And I agree with the congressman that as we go forward, I think it's going to become increasingly important to be more targeted in our interventions and to try to make sure, and this is in the spirit of your question, Shell, to try to make sure that particularly larger businesses, publicly funded businesses, that is businesses that can raise money in the stock market, businesses that have years of reserve versus weeks of reserves, don't get support that they don't need, and the ones that are unbanked or underbanked do. And in fact, one of the things I've heard, and Congressman, correct me if you've heard differently, is that the second version of the Paycheck Protection Program, which is the lending program targeted at small businesses, the second installation, which you just passed a few days ago, is rolling out more effectively than the first one in this regard.
Yeah, it was one of the that's exactly right, Jared. It was one of the mid-course corrections we made. We had carve-outs for smaller banks, community banks, and what we call CDFIs and minority-owned businesses to make sure we were getting down to some of the smaller businesses. And in fact, I don't remember the exact figures, but on the first tranche of SBA loans, the average size was well over 200,000. This second tranche, it was down to 70,000. That's the average. So there were a lot more loans and loan forgiveness grants being given to the smaller businesses to help those people. That was the intention. Really, the intention of all the bills, the CARES and then the interim bill, and I think the one to come, is to get as much aid as possible to small businesses and to individuals, because as Jared points out, this is a consumer-based economy. 70% of it is based on consumer spending. So if we want the economy to be healthy, we need consumers to be healthy. Rena?
Wow, thank you. So Dasha from Twitter wants to know, in a post-pandemic economy, do you foresee industry making adjustments to their global supply chains? What can the government do now to lessen the disruption?
Sounds like a Dr. Bernstein question to me.
You had me at supply chains, Dasha. This happened. This is something I think about a lot. And I'd like to talk a little bit about something I envision and something I think that members on the Hill are starting to envision as well. So I'd like you to fill in behind me, Congressman, either disabuse me of what I'm about to say to Dasha or confirm it. During the crisis, during this pandemic, it has come to our attention. We have seen that some of the supply chains on which we depend, international flows of goods on which we depend to meet vital healthcare needs, are more fragile than we thought they were, more fragile than we liked, and more fragile than we need them to be. And we even began to see some of that during Trump's trade war. Now, I was a big opponent of the trade war for reasons we can get into, having to do with some of the beneficial aspects of international trade. In fact, Washington State is a big exporter in this regard, so I suspect that view may resonate with some of the folks on the meeting with us tonight. I am a big supporter of global trade flows, but I'm also someone who recognizes the damage that imbalanced trade has had on communities throughout our country. And I want to marry those two observations, some of the problems we've had with persistent trade imbalances and the weakness of our supply chains. And what I would like to propose, Dasha, is that Congress begins to think more about, and I think they're beginning to, that's what I want the congressman to tell me about. Congress begins to think more about what we call import substitution, meaning domestic replacement of existing supply chains, making some things here that we currently import from abroad. Not everything, not the most, not even a lot. Actually, I'd like to do a relatively marginal amount of substitution of domestic production for imported production. But I think it's time to think, at least to open up a conversation about replacing some international supply chains that we can't depend on in our time of need. What do you think,
Jared? Agreed. And you're absolutely right. There's an increasing amount of conversation and dialogue among ourselves in Congress on that point. And a lot of it deals with the obvious. Some of these personal protective devices that we just were without. And that can go all the way from the N95 masks to gowns to booties to the ventilators and right on down the line. But the truth of the matter is that not the 100-year flood, but this 500-year flood that we're experiencing, if I may use that metaphor, they tend to reveal these things. And it's an opportunity then to correct them, strategically identifying where it is that we will do better to withstand the next pandemic. And I want to remind everybody that our very own Bill Gates has been warning about this for quite some time. This was inevitable. Somebody that's predicting that you're going to have a 500-year flood isn't often listened to, whether it is an actual flood or a volcano or a pandemic. But it seems to me that we have had brought home to us in the deepest, most painful way, the reality that a pandemic is very possible, and we now understand the damage it can do, and the better prepared we are for it. And it goes beyond just the equipment, the manufacturing capacity to stand up treatment or to stand up vaccine production. These are things that should and will be analyzed going forward, hopefully before we get to the after action debriefing that will necessarily come as a result of this. So you're absolutely right, Jared. The truth is that we probably ought to take a step back and ask ourselves that question in a broader basis, still yet on the margin, because the global economy isn't going away, but there are these areas where we would be smart to do a review. And it would be smart as can be for us to significantly fill the strategic reserve or supply of these items, because we could indeed suffer another pandemic. Rena.
Thank you. Carolyn from Facebook. It's imperative that employees not be forced to return to a workplace without required safety measures and without any liability for the business. Can you commit to working for mandatory safety measures?
Yes, and moreover, we have been working to significantly increase the supply. There's a couple of enormous frustrations I have had in the midst of this. And frankly, the first one was the president's failure to utilize the Defense Production Act to stand up testing. Everybody understands that we're not going to fully rescue our economy until we defeat the virus. We're not going to fully defeat the virus until we develop a vaccine. But in the meantime, we can sure as heck win every battle by doing certain things: social distancing and practicing all the hygiene recommendations, then robust tracing, robust quarantining, while we're developing treatment and while we're developing the vaccine. We could have done this so much better if the president had been willing to utilize the Defense Production Act and get going on some of these things, both with respect to personal protective equipment and the treatment and the vaccine. And by the way, we have been supplying not just millions, not just hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars for the purchase of these things, so that this equipment can get out there. You know, I have to say, what's the name of the person who asked the question, Rena?
Carolyn.
Rena?
So this is Carolyn.
Carolyn, thank you, Jared, with his razor sharp memory. Thank you for asking that question.
I write it down.
Oh, hands free. I'm married to an Italian. I talk with my hands. I can't write. So your question reminds me of one of the wonderful things in the midst of all this pain that has come out of this tragedy. And that is how we finally recognize that people who do certain jobs are essential in every meaning of the spirit of that term. Whether they're working in a convenience store and interfacing, or working in a grocery store and interfacing, all the healthcare workers, the people that pick up your municipal waste every week who are essential. These are essential people, essential workers for our economy. They are also our neighbors.
I have nothing to add to that. Well said. Let's go. We should go to the next question.
All
By the
right.
way, excuse me, Rena, I have a question for the congressman, but I don't need to ask it yet. But I want to make sure I just put in my order, because I have a question for him later.
Of course. We'll save you for last. How about that?
Thanks. Yep.
All right. Lynn from Facebook wants to know, why are large corporations receiving stimulus money while small businesses are having to set up GoFundMe accounts in hopes of getting by?
Well, it's contrary to the spirit of what we do, by and large, let me tell you. Obviously, we've now appropriated more than $700 billion for small business loans, which would be forgivable. The aid that was available to most large businesses was not a bailout, it was a loan basis. There are exceptions to that in the aviation industry and certain aviation defense related industries. And the reason for that was the answer to the question as to whether or not we would be better off if a whole bunch of these airlines went bankrupt was probably not. But the thrust of what the bill did was to drive assistance to individuals, bottom up, if you will. And that's the right approach, I believe, economically. I certainly think it's the right approach from a value standpoint. It's the right approach economically because of what we've talked about here. We have an economy that's 70% based on consumer activity. That's why we had the $1,200 payment. That's why we had the increase in unemployment compensation, those who are in particular need, increasing the minimum benefit by $600 a week. That's what the thrust of what we do is get money into the hands of the individuals. Those who rely on capital markets and can resort to capital markets should not be in on this deal. You saw that some publicly traded companies went in on that, and some of them gave it back after public pressure. Secretary Mnuchin didn't like it. I'm with him on this. You saw some organizations, frankly, like the Los Angeles Lakers had one of those loans. They eventually gave it back. That is not in keeping with what we intended whatsoever. I don't think it's in keeping with what we need to do to get the economy moving.
Let me just add a few points, 2 points to that. The first point is that I think there was kind of a mistake in the way that the PPP, the small business lending program, Paycheck Protection Program, went out the door. That contributed to the problem that Lynn mentioned, which was and is a big problem, but is less of a problem having gone through some of what we did. We're trying to, I think the execution is trying to correct for some of that. But here's what happened. Why did the Los Angeles Lakers get a small business grant, right? So why did Shake Shack, Ruth Chris Steakhouse, some of the more publicized companies that have thousands and thousands of workers, how did they get a loan or a grant that was earmarked for those who have under 500 employees? Because they're franchises. That is, the initial bill was written in such a way is that if your company is on what's called the franchise list of the Small Business Administration, it doesn't matter if you put all your different steakhouses together and that gets you to a number way over 500, as long as any one of them has, or as long as they all have, fewer than 500 employees for each one. And, I guess maybe the Lakers have less than 500 people working for them, but whatever, it was a mistake based on this franchise list. And so that's not that hard a thing to fix. You just shut down the franchise list, or at least you shut it down based on a cutoff on the size of the companies. Okay, that's point two, which you also referenced, is just about broad oversight. Well, and the congressman mentioned this earlier, and I just want to underscore it. There is an oversight panel whose job it is, as I understand, and correct me, Congressman Heck, if I have this wrong, whose job it is to pay particularly close oversight to another part of what happened in the CARES Act. And that was a $500 billion allocation to provide loans to big businesses. And absent oversight, absent careful oversight and consistent reporting, transparency from this oversight, that money could easily get wasted and go to corporations that don't need it. It so happens that when I was running today, I was listening to NPR, and the chairperson, I think he's a chairperson of that oversight board, was on, and he means business. He sounded great. And he was talking about, they have to write reports, I think either weekly or monthly, I think weekly reports, reporting on their oversight. So it's up to us and people like Lynn, who are concerned citizens, to track that and make sure that we're paying attention to that oversight and putting feet to the fire. Because, as the congressman explained, the kinds of public pressure that was meted out on some of these firms who shouldn't have gotten the grant actually worked. They returned it. So sunlight remains the best disinfectant.
Well said, Jared. Some of those people were just frankly gaming the system. That's what it amounted to. And it's our job to try and stop it dead in its tracks.
Thank you both. Ralph from Constituent Mail says, stop spending money we don't have. We are a capitalist country, not socialist.
Sending money. Is there any?
Spending.
Oh, spending money.
Stop spending money.
Ralph, I'm going to admit that we may respectfully disagree on this, sir. The truth is, like Dr. Bernstein, I'm kind of a committed Keynesian. It's at times like this precisely that I believe that collectively through the federal government, we need to step up and do what we can to halt the free fall of this economy and all of the people that are in such pain and frankly suffering so great economically. I tend to view this a little differently, not just from an economic theory standpoint. I actually think that we're the richest country in the world, and collectively we have a lot of wealth here that can be brought to bear on this and that can help not just rescue this economy, but rebuild this economy. At some point here, I'm going to turn aspirational on our objectives here, not just to rebuild this economy, but to rebuild it better, bigger, faster than before, a way that enables more broadly shared prosperity. We've gone through 40 years where wage growth has been fairly stagnant for a lot of reasons. This is an opportunity to revisit the underlying causes of that. We also have an economy that frankly isn't very kind or gentle on Mother Earth, if you will pardon the old hippie expression of this. We need to rebuild an economy that is kinder and gentler to Mother Earth. It's the only Earth we've got, as a matter of fact. And we do have the collective wealth to do this, to rebuild our economy, to be better and longer, and to be fair for more people involved.
So, Ralph, I actually partially share your concern, and the partial thing is important because, like the congressman, I think when you're in a situation like this where the private sector is literally shut down by fiat because it has to if we're going to flatten these curves, then the only game in town is for governments to pick up the slack temporarily. And that's the key. That's the key, Ralph. It's where you have a very good point, one that should be more appreciated, is not in the bust, but it's in the boom. And you see, the thing that we did that I object to, and let me go back to Keynes, because we keep talking about Keynes. So Keynes was the great British economist who had many of the insights I just articulated. He apparently came to America once and he was talking to economists there, and they were talking about spending all this government money when the economy is doing pretty well. And he said to them, "You're more Keynesian than I am." And he was Keynes. And so the point is, the thing that I don't like that we've done, Ralph, and I think you and I agree here, is that we did all this deficit spending through these Trump tax cuts in particular, but from some spending bills as well. We did all this spending, put it on the deficit when the economy was strong. And I actually think that when your economy is strong, that's when your budget deficit should start to come down. That's when you should start to get closer in what you collect and what you spend out. That gap between what you collect and what you spend should start to close when you're in a strong economy, so that when you're in a weak economy like now, it can open. And so I half agree with you, and that I think we should have been more conscious of our fiscal constraints on the upside. But now that we're on the downside, I don't think we can afford to pull back. We need to have an economy capable of bouncing back on the other side of this.
Yeah, what he said. I agree with that.
Thank you both. Hannah from Facebook. When will we be able to start turning back to a normal state? Some of us essentially are working, struggling more than those on unemployment. We need help to get back on track with all of our bills. How are we going to get those help with bills so we don't go back on the streets? Some of us don't qualify for the stimulus check. How can you help those people?
So the $1,200 was, I'm inferring that they weren't eligible for the $1,200 and they're not unemployed. But the question is that they are still struggling. Not knowing what it is they do for a living, it's a little harder out of context to answer that question. For example, if they're a small business or if they're a regular salaried person. There is consideration in CARES Point 2 or 2.0 rather, for an additional stimulus check. It's not clear to me yet what the threshold would be and whether or not people would consider adjusting it. The premise of it, however, is that we know we need to get more money into the hands of more people in order to not just help them, but to help this economy. Thank you for the question very much.
So let me respond to Hannah, but also this kind of bleeds into my question for the congressman. So let me ask it now after I quickly respond to Hannah. So Hannah, the people who did, first of all, it's important to make sure you're not eligible for the check, the $1,200 check, because the only folks who should have been ineligible for that are people who have, quite high incomes, which from your question, you're not one of them. Sorry, I wish you were, but it sounds like you're not. And undocumented immigrants. But if you're not getting a check, say, because you didn't file your taxes, you're actually eligible. And you just have to go on the website and go on the IRS website and click through some. I've done it myself just to see what it was like, and click through some pages that are, I think, hopefully not too demanding. So you might be more eligible than you think. So here's my question. One of the things Hannah said reminded me of something that has been missing in all of these CARES Acts so far, all of these relief measures, and it's something that's dear to your heart. And I believe that you've proposed something to fix this, and I want to give you a chance to say something about it, if I'm correct. We've done almost nothing for renters. And if you listen to Hannah, you heard I thought I heard something in there, look, I got a bill coming due, which could be a rent. And, there are people who are months, potentially months away from a potential eviction. Now, I know many cities, I don't know about Seattle, many cities have eviction moratoriums, but I've been thinking we've got to get some rental assistance in here. And I was reading up on this today and I saw your name. So tell me, it's a bit of an alley-oop pass here.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. Yes, that's true. Let me just start by saying what my priorities are for CARES 2.0 and that which I've been working the hardest in advocating for. There's a series of things, but two that are uppermost in my mind. First of all is aid to local and state government and tribal governments. Their revenues have fallen off the table. They don't have the tools the federal government has available. More than 15% of the nation's entire workforce is employed at the local or the state government level. They deliver vital service to people. And in some cases like Washington State, there's a bunch of it that is exempt from being reduced. In fact, about 70% of our state budget cannot be reduced. It's either K-12, the public school system, which has a particular constitutional protection in our state. Well, it should. And Medicaid, you cannot reduce those. As a consequence, all of the burden then falls on the rest of it. And in fact, the Director of Office of Financial Management projected this week that between now and the end of next biennium, a shortfall of nearly $7 billion, at least. At the state level, that's an enormous amount of money. And I'm bringing this up because you know what one of the things is, and the 30% that will have to bear all of this burden? Public health, the very thing that we need right now. And so it's really important that the federal government play a strong partnership role in providing more local and state and tribal government assistance to them, so that they don't have to reduce vital services like public health, and so that they don't have to lay people off. That's not a way to recover your economy, is to increase unemployment. And the second that I'm advocating for, arguably an equally high priority, is a $100 billion rental assistance program. So in previous packages at the federal level and at the state level, there have been eviction protections provided to renters. You can't evict them during this crisis. And that's understandable. It's completely understandable. Where would they go? On the other hand, you know full well that if they can't pay their rent, there's somebody that's not collecting the rent and therefore paying their loan. You also know that this is setting that renter up, in all likelihood, in some instances, for some downstream unfavorable treatment. You're also putting the pressure on them to make this rent and weigh it off against medicine, weigh it off against food, weigh it off against all other sorts of other basic needs. And so we've provided suspension of mortgage payments for people that have federally backed mortgages that are held in federally backed securities. We've provided eviction protection, but we haven't provided the funds to enable those that are on the cusp of losing their apartment. We should remember that people who rent and have apartments have on average much lower income than those who actually own their homes, for whom we gave a form of assistance. So this is kind of the missing piece. And the bill that I've introduced would provide $100 billion for needs-based rental assistance driven through the Emergency Solutions Program, I think it's called, and it's being actively considered. It's an interesting coalition of support that we have to bring together, people who represent low-income advocates, the landlords themselves. Here they have a common cause. The landlords want to get paid, and the renters need to be able to pay. And so as a consequence, we've advanced this proposal, and leadership has been receptive to it thus far, but we have a little bit left of the, excuse me, we have a little bit left of the race to run. I am cautiously optimistic. Thank you very much for prompting that answer, Jared.
Yeah,
very much. We've been working very hard on this.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jared, for the question, Congressman Heck for the answer. As a follow-up, Susan from Facebook wanted to say, please support the U.S. Postal Service and work on some form of universal health care.
So let me deal with the first of those questions first, and the first part of that question first, and tell you this is one of those that's deeply personal to me. My grandfather was a postal letter carrier in rural Texas, of all places. He began working for the U.S. Postal Service in 1905, and he delivered the mail on a horse. One of the biggest days in his life is when he got his Model T. And he worked for the Postal Service from 1905 and 1944, when he slumped over dead while out fixing the fence on his hardscrabble farm. The Postal Service is hemorrhaging money. We're down a third, I believe, in mail delivery or more from where we were a year ago. And that means less revenue that they depend on. It is inconceivable to me that we would allow the Postal Service to go bankrupt and to fold it and to submit to just private carriers all of this delivery. When you consider the nature of what it is that is delivered, like, again, people's prescription drugs, we need a postal service. We need a public postal service. I've introduced a bill that would shore up the Postal Service's financial situation, see if we can't get beyond this point and restore a little bit of financial health to them. They have a requirement under federal law, although they are quasi-public. They're not an entirely public agency. They're not entirely a private agency. But they have a requirement that nobody else does, which is that they advance fund their healthcare benefits for all their employees for all time. And that's a burden, frankly, that we don't expect of any other private corporation or even the public sector. and it is weighing them down. And that in and of itself would help them a lot. So there are a lot of things that we can do and must do. And frankly, we need to do them fairly quickly because this thing is deteriorating for them. Your question about universal health care, I don't think we should stop until we have affordable, quality health care accessible to everybody. We made a big step forward with the Affordable Care Act. We cut the number of uninsured in half. We still have some to go. I think we're down to 12%, give or take. I'm sure Jared will know the number better than I do. But we still also have issues of affordability. People who do have health care, whose premiums are going up, whose copays are going up. One of the biggest reasons that insurance goes up so fast is the cost of prescription drugs. And I've long maintained that there's just no reason why Medicare can't negotiate as a buyer of drugs, just like you could if you were in the private sector. Overall, I'll conclude here and let Dr. Bernstein in on the auction, but our economy would function better and healthcare would be less expensive if, in fact, we had universal healthcare that was run more efficiently than the system that we have. There's a lot about our healthcare system that people admire. It has some of the strongest, best minds in the world. We have some of the most advanced techniques that are developed here, but there's a lot about it that can and should be improved. Over to you, Jared.
Well, I was just about to say all those things, so you've cut into my act here. You know, it's funny. I used to feel very critical. I used to give kind of the same rap you just gave, Congressman, but I'd leave out the last part about all the good parts of our system because I was so annoyed with all the bad economics. And then let me see, what are we in? A year and a month ago, I had a very serious stroke. I went to the hospital, and which happened to be 10 miles away, so I was very lucky. And I experienced the best part of our Cadillac health system, and I'm alive today to talk about it. I am a white privileged person, affluent, lives in an urban area. There are a lot of people who don't have those characteristics. So I'm not saying that, I just got lucky. It's not an accident who gets what in this country. But there are parts of our healthcare system that we must preserve. The problem is, and I'll just talk a little about the economics because I'm right where the congressman is. We treat healthcare like a market good, but it's not really a market good. If you want to go get an apple, go to the store and buy an apple. And if the apple supply is too low, apples are going to be expensive, and you're either going to pay for an apple because you really want one and you have the money to afford one, or you're going to buy a grapefruit. And that's just the way it is. And I think that's fine. If you go to the store and you're hungry, they don't have to feed you. If you go to the hospital and you're sick, they have to treat you. Okay? Think about that for a minute. If you go to the store and you're hungry, and I knock on the door of Safeway, that's our supermarket here, and say, I'm hungry, give me food, they're going to say, get the heck out of here. If I go to the hospital, like I did, and was potentially fatally ill, they will treat me because they have to. That means that we've already taken healthcare out of the market. And yet we have this weird quasi-market system, that really doesn't work when you compare the expenditures to that of all the other countries that in many cases have similar quality of care, but instead of spending 18% of their GDP on healthcare, they spend 10% of it. And, in our economy, that missing 8%, that's, close to $2 trillion that we, kind of squander. And so I agree that we need to get on a path to universal health care. And I have to say, I haven't been very partisan tonight because I really am a pretty bipartisan person. I hope that comes across. But on this issue, the two parties couldn't be more different. And one party wants to plot a path to universal coverage and wants to support the Affordable Care Act, and that's Democrats, and one party doesn't. Now, we can argue about which party is right about that, but we can't argue about the fact that as we speak, the Trump administration is trying to end the Affordable Care Act in court, which is not well reported, but it's true. They're prosecuting a case that would undermine the Affordable Care Act, and they have consistently been very much in that camp of trying to treat healthcare like a market good. And I got to tell you, that just won't work at the end of the day.
So, Jared, I have a question for you. Turnabout's fair play. Before I do that, I think I've discovered another reason why we're brothers from a different mother. Something I've never actually acknowledged in public. I've never denied it. I had a stroke too a few years ago. And like you, I was blessed as a privileged white male to be able to receive outstanding health care and to have a complete and full recovery. At least I think I've had a complete and full recovery.
Yeah,
Another
that's
reason why
interesting.
we're
Yeah,
connected, friend.
I didn't know that.
Okay, so here's my question. Back to the economy and the effects of this deep recession and high levels of unemployment. One of the things that bothers me most is we have an economy that functions basically as a last in, first out. And what I mean by that is some of the last people to begin to enjoy the benefits of expansion and a healthy economy are some of the first people that are kicked out. We
True.
have, as we all know, structural racism and issues of a structural disadvantage to people of lower income. You keep referring to the fact that the actual number is 40% of Americans do not have $400 in emergency funds, cash, to repair the water heater or whatever. And so, Jared, can you talk a little bit about what it is in particular over time that we should do that can help with that situation? Because it just seems that every time we go through the cycle of a recession, anybody that's just starting to get up there goes to the bottom again and has to crawl their way back up.
Yeah, I can talk about that. And I think there's some lessons from the last economic expansion, which was a quite a strong expansion that just ended a couple of months ago because of the virus. Some lessons we learned in there. From the way I think about this as an economist is macro and micro, meaning the overall economy or the macro economy, but also drilling down to some individual people and places and trying to help them with their specific problems. In the macro economy, one of the things that we observed over this last expansion is that if we allow the unemployment rate to fall low enough, it's going to pull in a lot of people who would otherwise be left behind. Now, that might sound strange to somebody who doesn't kind of play around in the macro sandbox the way I do. But the unemployment rate is actually a variable that is partially controlled by the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the country. I'm sure you've heard about, the chair is Jerome Powell. He gives all these talks. Everybody listens carefully. And, the Federal Reserve is a sort of complicated institution. It's basically if the Supreme Court is the court of the land, the Federal Reserve is the bank of the land. So they oversee the banking system, but they also play a key role in determining the interest rates throughout the economy. And one of the things they've historically done is they've convinced themselves that if unemployment gets too low, inflation is going to take off. So we have to keep unemployment at 5 or 6%. Well, when unemployment is 6%, the unemployment rate for Black Americans is 12%. And so, 12% sounds really terrible, but that's actually what a lot of people in non-white communities have to live with when powerful economists make this mistake of not recognizing how low the unemployment rate will fall. Well, thanks to some great Federal Reserve chairs, Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke, now Jerome Powell, we've allowed the unemployment rate to fall much lower than it has before. Inflation hasn't done anything. I always knew that theory was wrong, and I've been writing about it critically for 20 years. So the rest of the world has caught up with me on that regard, and a few others. But so that's the micro, that's the macro. Run the economy hot so that people who really depend on that can get a chance. But then there's the micro, which is you've got to help a lot of people who face steep labor market barriers. It might be discrimination, racial discrimination. It's alive and well. Not well, but it's alive. It might be a criminal record. It might be a skill set problem. And that has to do with more micro level interventions, training programs, rules that penalize employers for discriminating. And I think if you put the macro together with the micro, we can do a lot to correct the problem that you've mentioned, the structural racism and its impact on the economy, and provide people who really need it, who want to be in the game, helping themselves, helping their family, helping the macro economy, have the opportunities that they deserve.
Thank you for that so very, very much, Jared. As you know, this issue of the Federal Reserve not making an accurate assessment of what actual full employment is has been, I think, the principal reason why wages have been suppressed for 40 years. There are a lot of other reasons there. I think it's number one. And like you, I believe that first Ben, then Janet, now Jay Powell have been moving away from that, and I'm grateful for that. It's kind of a moot point for a while here because we're going to have very high unemployment for a while. Someday we will return to this issue of what is the appropriate level to allow unemployment to get to. And I hope we have learned the lesson and stop fighting the war of the late 70s of high inflation and allow real full employment to take place so more people can enjoy prosperity in this country. That as much as any, that along with housing, frankly, are the two issues that have kind of defined my activity on the Financial Services Committee. I should throw in the Export-Import Bank too. Rita.
Thank you both for that. Unfortunately, we have time for one more before we close up. Julia from Facebook says, let people go back to work, pay their bills, and keep a roof over their head. You can print all the money you want, but you can't eat it.
Julia, nobody wants people to get back to work any faster than I do. The fact of the matter is that we will not, however, be able to do that until we have made more progress on corralling and ultimately defeating the virus. And if we do not do that, then the amount of damage to the economy will be even greater. I didn't use the specific example of what happened in 1918 when there were several celebrations of World War I planned and canceled in most eastern cities except Philadelphia. So they allowed tens of thousands of people to take to the street, and the influenza took off hugely in Philadelphia, more so than in the other cities, Boston and New York, that had canceled their celebrations. And you know what? It took a lot longer for Philadelphia's economy to get back on its feet. These things go hand in hand. We have to be very mindful of the suffering that's occurring out there and doing what we can to mitigate it, because we share the same goal, getting back to a strong economy with good jobs available to people.
Julia, let me just speak to this. As I said earlier to someone, I totally share your sentiment, and I hear you, and I feel for you. And frankly, again, I'm privileged. I'm drawing a paycheck. I'm on these Zoom meetings all day, so I am not going to complain. But I'm dying to get back to a normal work life too. I want to make 2 points. One is a little tangential, but I want to say it before we end. I think what would help, so everything that Congressman said, I think is just unequivocally true. And frankly, I think we'll get back to work a lot less quickly if we don't listen to those lessons, because we'll have a second wave and consumers and investors will be that much more spooked the next time it comes around. But what we need is a plan, is some kind of I would like a national coordination, a plan that tells us, here's where we are, here's what we have to do, and here's how we'll get back to work, that doesn't have anything to do with drinking bleach or ultraviolet light. And we haven't gotten that plan from our presidential leadership, so that he kicks it to the states. Well, we're starting to see some states with some smart plans. So I don't know enough about Washington, and maybe the congressman can tell us about that. But I read Andrew Cuomo's plan carefully, and I thought it was very smart. And I commend it to you. It's a very readable thing. You can find a newspaper article about it. And it's an interesting thing too, because New York is a place that has rural and urban areas. And the plan is to open the rural areas first because they kind of have a built-in distancing, and then get to the more urban areas. But it's my belief that if we had a coherent, smart plan, that people like Julia and myself and others would feel better, because we at least see where we are and where we're headed. And so that's the first point. The second point is a little tangential. You talk about wanting to get back to work, and I'm with you all the way. Here's the other thing I really want. I want schools to open. I think it's really, really important for schools to open when it's safe, of course. I say that partially because, and I have to be a little quiet here because my daughters are right outside the room, but I have two kids. I have a daughter home from college and a daughter, a senior in high school, and I love them. I love having them around, but I also want them to go when the time comes. And I know they're not watching this, but from an economic standpoint, that's personal. It's really important if we're going to get to a reopening where people like Julia and others can get back to work, to get the schools back up and running, because parents don't have childcare options. They have to have school in order to be able to work. And colleges are really looking at some very devastating economic outcomes. Not the top 5 who have endowments forever, but the vast majority of college, not unlike the state and local fiscal crisis you talked about earlier. So I hope that as we think about getting back to work and the plan to do so, we can also think about school in that regard.
Thank you so much to you both for this invigorating conversation, and to all of you participating in the Facebook comments right now. I am going to close up this Facebook Live event, but thank you so much to all of you for joining. Have a great evening.
Rena? Well,
yes.
Before you hit the stop button, please just again express my appreciation to everybody that joined us. Stay vigilant for these episodes of town halls that we're going to continue to do on the virus. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And as I like to say, giving of your most precious commodity, your time, and a most special expression of gratitude to my friend Jared Bernstein. Friend, you met and exceeded all expectations I would have about a guest on this conversation. And I just have to tell you, Jared, it was an honor to have you here this evening. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon, I hope.
I do too. Thank you, Rena.
Thank you.